Cross a single bridge in New York, and everything changes. The skyline shifts, the accents sound different, the food even tastes different. It feels less like one city and more like 5 completely separate worlds stitched together. And that's because it is. New Yorkers don't just say they're from New York, they say they're from Brooklyn or Queens or the Bronx. But how did this strange system of boroughs come to exist? Why did 5 rival cities merge into one? And why does the rivalry still burn more than a century later? Stay with me, because the story of New York's boroughs is full of bitter votes, dramatic protests, near secessions, and one of the closest elections in U.S. history. New York is often called the most iconic city in the United States. But the truth is, it's not a single city at all. It's 5 counties, 5 boroughs, 5 distinct histories, identities, and cultures, bound uneasily together under one name. On a map, they look united. In reality, the boundaries still shape daily life. Your commute, your housing prices, even your politics. And what's even stranger, no other city in the world is organized quite like this. London has 32 boroughs, but they've always been part of one city. Paris has 20 arrondissements, carved like slices of a wheel around the Seine. Tokyo has 23 wards, each with local power. But New York is the result of 5 counties, once rivals, even enemies, forced into a single municipal marriage. And the story of how that happened reveals why the city still feels fractured today. So let's step back in time, back before there was a New York City, when there were instead 5 independent communities with their own loyalties, and no one imagined they'd ever become one. Before the year 1898, the place we now call New York City didn't exist. Not really. Manhattan was the city of New York, the beating financial heart of the nation. The Bronx was farmland and scattered villages, a buffer zone between the city and the rest of New England. Staten Island was semi-rural and politically resistant to outside control. Queens was stitched together from small towns with their own identities. And then there was Brooklyn. Brooklyn wasn't just another town, it was a powerhouse. By 1860, Brooklyn was the 3rd largest city in America, right behind Philadelphia and Manhattan itself. It had its own government, its own police force, its own schools, and its own booming waterfront industry. Many Brooklynites saw no reason they should ever bow to Manhattan. The cultural differences ran deep. Manhattan streets were crowded with immigrant Catholics, packed into tenements, running small businesses, and working the docks. Brooklyn was seen as more suburban, more Protestant, more middle class. Crossing the East River in the 19th century wasn't just a geographic shift, it was a cultural one. Meanwhile, Staten Island symbolized the independent street. In 1858, when New York's government ordered a quarantine hospital for incoming ships, Staten Islanders didn't just protest, they burned the entire hospital down. That was how fiercely some boroughs resisted outside authority. Yet, even with the divisions, something else was happening beneath the surface. The harbor connected all of them. Goods and people moved constantly across rivers and bridges. By the late 1800s, thousands commuted daily across borough lines for work. Industry didn't stop at the water's edge. In practice, these separate towns were already functioning like pieces of the same machine, just without a unified system to manage them. And that was becoming a problem. By the second half of the 19th century, leaders knew the region was outgrowing its patchwork design. Each borough ran its own ferries, docks, and police departments. Public transit systems didn't connect, streets didn't align. The inefficiency was obvious. Enter Andrew Haswell Green, the man later called the father of Greater New York. He had a vision of a single unified metropolis, an integrated port, a centralized government, one city that could rival the great capitals of the world. But Green and his allies weren't just thinking about efficiency, they were worried about competition. Because to the west, Chicago was rising. Fueled by railroads and Great Lakes trade, Chicago's population exploded, more than 1 million by 1890. And when Chicago beat New York to host the World's Fair in 1893, the insult cut deep. The fair was a massive success, drawing global praise. Suddenly, New York elites feared their city might lose its edge as America's premier center of power. Meanwhile, Albany, the state legislature, was flexing more authority over the region, and Manhattan's leaders wanted to consolidate before they lost more influence. There was also the water crisis. By the 1890s, Brooklyn's population had surged, but its water system hadn't kept up. Residents complained about dirty taps, low pressure, and salt water seeping into wells. Manhattan, by contrast, had the Croton Aqueduct, one of the great engineering marvels of its age, delivering clean water from upstate. For Brooklyn, consolidation wasn't just about politics, it was about survival. Still, for all the logic, resistance was fierce. Brooklyn feared losing its independence. Staten Island feared being neglected. Queens was divided. Only Manhattan and parts of the Bronx were firmly on board. But as business leaders and reformers pushed harder, the idea of a single Greater New York began to take hold. And soon, the question would be put to a vote. By 1894, decades of arguments about consolidation finally came down to the people themselves. A citywide referendum would decide the future. Should the separate cities and counties merge into one Greater New York? In Manhattan, support was strong. The city stood to gain resources and expand its reach. The Bronx leaned yes as well. Its growing suburbs were already tied to Manhattan for jobs and trade. Queens was divided. Some towns welcomed modern infrastructure, others feared being swallowed up. Staten Island resisted hardest, convinced Manhattan politicians would neglect them. And then came Brooklyn, the biggest rival of all. Proudly independent, the third largest city in America at the time, Brooklyn saw itself as a worthy equal to Manhattan, not a junior partner. Editorials denounced consolidation as a takeover. When the votes were counted, the result was shocking. Brooklyn approved consolidation by just 277 votes out of nearly 129,000 cast, a margin of less than 1/4%. It was one of the closest, most consequential local elections in American history. Imagine that. The entire shape of modern New York decided by fewer people than it takes to fill a single subway car. Quick question for you. Do you think Brooklyn made the right choice, or should it have stayed its own city? Let me know in the comments, because history could have gone either way. So why did those few hundred votes tip yes? The answer was simple: water. Brooklyn's local wells and reservoirs were running dry, even tainted by salt water from the coast. Manhattan's Croton Aqueduct, delivering clean upstate water, looked like salvation. Civic pride gave way to necessity, and the merger moved forward. January 1st, 1898. Fireworks exploded over City Hall Park. Crowds cheered as Robert A. Van Wyck was sworn in as the first mayor of the new Greater New York. Overnight, the map was transformed. 5 counties became 5 boroughs. More than 3.4 million people were suddenly part of one municipality, instantly making New York the second largest city in the world behind only London. The word borough wasn't new. It had roots in England and some US states, but it had never been used this way, as subdivisions of a single city. The term gave the new arrangement a sense of unity, but also allowed each region to keep its identity intact. But celebration was not universal. In Manhattan, it felt like victory, proof the city was destined to be America's capital of commerce and culture. But in Brooklyn, the mood was funereal. Local papers wrote obituaries for the city itself, calling the merger the death of Brooklyn. To many residents, it felt less like progress and more like surrender. Queens entered awkwardly, its patchwork of towns bound together under a new borough identity that didn't quite fit. Staten Island remained wary, resigned but mistrustful of Manhattan's dominance. And then there was the Bronx. At first, the Bronx was annexed to Manhattan, part of New York County rather than its own. But its population exploded once the subway reached it in 1904, and by 1914, it became a county and a borough in its own right. Still, even as Greater New York was born, the cracks showed immediately. The city might have been united on paper, but in practice, each borough held on to its sense of independence. Old loyalties, old rivalries, and old resentments didn't vanish with the stroke of a pen. The real test was still to come. Could these 5 boroughs, stitched together by politics, actually function as one city? On paper, New York became one city in 1898. In reality, the boroughs still lived like 5 separate towns. The problem? They weren't connected. The subway didn't open until 1904, and at first, most lines only served Manhattan. Brooklyn and Queens waited decades to be fully tied in, while Staten Island never got a subway at all. It still relies on ferries and one bridge. Bridges did help stitch the city together. First the Brooklyn Bridge in 1883, then a wave of others in the early 1900s. They became steel lifelines linking once isolated boroughs into a single urban network. But transit was fragmented too. Competing private subway companies ran their own systems until 1940, when the city finally unified them under public control. By then, the subway had become the backbone of the city, growing into the largest system in the world with 472 stations and over 4 million riders every day. And yet, unity remains imperfect. A 2023 study found that 2 million New Yorkers live in transit deserts. Neighborhoods in southern Brooklyn, eastern Queens, and the Bronx where reliable trains don't reach. Just like in the 1890s, being part of New York never guaranteed equal access. If steel bridges and subway tunnels tied the city together physically, politics kept it divided. When consolidation happened, borough presidents were created to protect local interests. They had limited powers, but they gave each borough a voice. Behind them, though, real power lay with the political machines. Manhattan had Tammany Hall, infamous for its web of ward bosses. Brooklyn ran on neighborhood Democratic clubs. The Bronx produced Edward J. Flynn, a kingmaker in national politics. Each borough had its own system of favors and patronage, and no one boss could control them all. The result? New York was governed not as one city, but as a series of bargains, negotiated borough by borough. If you wanted to run citywide, you needed all 5 machines on your side. That borough power still matters today. Local resistance has delayed massive projects, from housing plans to highways. Even the Verrazzano Narrows Bridge, the only link between Staten Island and Brooklyn, was stalled for decades because Brooklyn residents refused to see their streets carved up. And here's something I'd love to hear from you. Do you think this kind of borough power makes New York stronger by protecting neighborhoods, or weaker by keeping the city divided? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm curious where you stand. It's the paradox of New York politics. One mayor, one council, but 5 stubborn power centers, each determined to defend its turf. And maybe that's why the boroughs feel so distinct. Each developed not just its own politics, but its own personality. Queens is the world's crossroads, over 160 languages spoken, more foreign-born residents than most U.S. states. A subway ride here can feel like crossing continents. The Bronx's invention. Hip-hop was born here in the 1970s before it conquered the globe. Yankee Stadium stands as a cathedral of sport. The borough's grit became a cultural export. Brooklyn was once the city of homes and churches. Today, it's the global Brooklyn brand. Brownstones, block parties, bookstores, a style imitated worldwide. Staten Island is the outlier. Suburban streets, the greenest borough with more parkland per capita than anywhere else. And the iconic Staten Island ferry carrying millions past the skyline for free. And Manhattan is the face of it all. The skyline, Wall Street, Broadway, Times Square, images burned into the world's imagination. Together, they don't just make up a city. They make up 5 different worlds, each proud, each distinct, and none willing to fully disappear into the others. But pride doesn't erase problems. If anything, the borough system also makes inequality impossible to ignore. For more than a century, critics have complained that New York is Manhattan-centric. Investment, infrastructure, and political attention flow disproportionately to the island at the city's core, while the outer boroughs often feel like afterthoughts. The disparities show up everywhere. Education. Manhattan schools consistently outperform many in the Bronx and parts of Brooklyn. Healthcare. Hospitals in the Bronx and eastern Queens struggle with fewer resources compared to Manhattan's world-class institutions. Housing tells the story even more starkly. In Brooklyn, median rents passed $3,000 in 2023, making it one of the most expensive rental markets in the country. Queens, too, has seen skyrocketing prices. Meanwhile, the Bronx has the lowest median income of the 5 boroughs, leaving many residents priced out of even their own neighborhoods. Transit deserts are another sign. Around 2 million New Yorkers live in areas without fast, reliable public transportation, overwhelmingly in the Bronx, eastern Queens, and southern Brooklyn. Without easy access to subways, commutes stretch into hours, and opportunities vanish with them. The irony is striking. The very merger designed to create a stronger, unified metropolis left behind layers of inequality that mirror the original divides. Manhattan may shine on postcards, but the borough system ensures that life on the edges of the city still feels like another world. The borough system was supposed to unify New York, but more than once, the opposite almost happened. The most dramatic moment came in 1993, when Staten Islanders went to the polls with a question as explosive as the one Brooklyn faced a century earlier. Should Staten Island leave New York City altogether? The answer shocked City Hall. Nearly 65% voted yes. For many Islanders, the reasons were clear. They felt neglected, ignored, and treated as an afterthought by Manhattan politicians. Their neighborhoods had little subway access. City services felt distant, and taxes were high. Staten Island became known as the Forgotten Borough, and for good reason. But secession didn't happen. The plan ran aground on legal grounds. Under the New York State Constitution, no borough could simply walk away. Staten Island was locked in, whether it liked it or not. Yet the resentment didn't die. Even today, calls for secession still pop up in local politics, echoing the same complaints voiced back in the 1890s. Fears of losing local control, unequal representation, cultural mismatch. The same tensions that once nearly kept New York from unifying remain alive, just in a modern form. And that's the paradox of New York City. On a map, it looks like one place. In reality, it's five. 5 counties, 5 boroughs, 5 distinct identities that overlap but never fully merge. This structure creates tension, unequal schools, housing crises, bitter politics, and endless rivalries. But it also sparks creativity, diversity, and resilience. Without Queens, New York wouldn't be the most linguistically diverse place on Earth. Without the Bronx, there's no hip-hop or Yankee dynasty. Without Brooklyn, no global Brooklyn brand. Without Staten Island, no ferry or green lungs of Parkland. And without Manhattan, no skyline, no Wall Street, no Broadway. The truth is, New York's greatness doesn't come from unity. It comes from friction. From 5 boroughs constantly colliding, competing, and pushing each other forward. That's why New York isn't just a city. It's 5 cities at once. And that's exactly what makes it unforgettable. You've been watching Geologic. If you enjoyed this journey through the city's hidden history, make sure to like, share, and subscribe because we've got more stories of how geography shapes history coming your way.